24 hours a day, 7 days a week, trucks are rolling. The drivers of these rigs are also helping to drive the day-to-day commerce that powers our economy. So it's important that they have the knowledge, skill, and commitment to help keep our roads safe for everyone who uses them. That's why the Department of Transportation has established hours of service regulations for commercial drivers who transport property and passengers. Setting limits on the amount of time drivers can spend behind the wheel helps to prevent fatigue that could lead to accidents, injuries, and worse. In this program, we will focus on the rules for truckers who move freight, as the regulations are a little different for drivers who transport passengers. We will discuss the purpose of these rules, what the regulations themselves require, and what you need to do to comply with them, so that you can stay safe when you are on the road. When you drive a truck for a living, you know there's a lot more to the job than just getting a load from point A to point B, because it's also your responsibility to get it there safely. When a truck driver pushes a little too hard or logs too many hours behind the wheel trying to go that extra mile, they can begin to suffer from driver fatigue. And driver fatigue creates serious hazards for everyone on the road. So the U.S. Department of Transportation places limits on how much time a driver can spend on duty and how much of that time they can spend operating a vehicle. Enforced by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, FMCSA, these hours of service regulations apply to drivers who are engaged in interstate commerce. Drivers not engaged in interstate commerce must usually comply with state regulations that are similar to the federal ones. Under hours of service regulations, the concepts of on-duty and off-duty time are very important. On-duty time includes any time you are working or are required to be ready to work, such as when you are driving a commercial vehicle for your motor carrier, loading, unloading, or handling paperwork, inspecting, servicing, or conditioning a truck, waiting to be dispatched while at a plant, terminal, or other location, or performing paid work for another employer. Off-duty time is defined as time that you spend relieved of all duty and responsibility for performing work, when you are free to pursue activities of your own choosing, such as sleeping or eating. Hours of service regulations specify how much time a driver must spend off-duty between on-duty periods and how off-duty time can be accumulated in a truck sleeper berth, as well as in its passenger seat, even when the truck is traveling. These limits are included in 3 basic regulations. To understand how the limits work together, it can be helpful to think of them as daily and weekly maximums. But it's also important to remember that the limits are not tied to a single 24-hour period or any specific days of the week. They can float to accommodate the start times that are required by your schedule. The basic daily service limit allows you a maximum of 14 consecutive hours on duty, of which you can spend 11 hours driving. At the same time, you will need to keep within one of 2 weekly limits, which allow you to be on duty 60 total hours over a 7-day period or 70 total hours over an 8-day period. Depending on whether your carrier operates their vehicles every day of the week, the 70-hour limit, or fewer than 7 days a week, the 60-hour limit. To ensure that truckers are complying with these rules, the FMCSA requires you to document your hours in a record of duty status, also known as a driver's daily log. Keeping your duty status log up to date not only helps you to keep track of how long you can continue to legally drive and when, it also creates a permanent record that shows you have been operating in compliance with the hours of service regulations. Drivers who do not comply, don't track their hours, or otherwise violate these rules can face significant fines. The FMCSA can even take them off the road. As you might expect, there are exceptions to the hours of service regulations, just as there are with most sets of rules. The time that you can spend on duty and driving and requirements for logging that time can vary depending on weather conditions, the distance you drive, and other specific job requirements. If you have questions about how the regulations apply to you, talk to your supervisor. The hours of service regulations established by the FMCSA include a set of safe work practices that help truckers maximize their paid time on duty and behind the wheel while avoiding driver fatigue. To help do this, the regulations require drivers to track and document their hours. This not only helps you to stay on top of when and for how long you can legally drive, it shows that you and your motor carrier are complying with the law. For many years, truck drivers have recorded their official record of duty status using a handwritten paper log. However, nowadays, electronic recording devices are also often used. But to illustrate the log-keeping process, we will focus on written examples because they are more visual. We'll address electronic logging later. For now, let's take a look at the log-keeping requirements themselves. Most truck drivers who are subject to FMCSA hours of service regulations must complete a 24-hour logbook page for each day that they work. Those who fail to comply with the requirement can be fined or even taken off the road. There are some situations in which drivers can be exempted from log keeping. To find out if your work qualifies you for 150 air-mile radius, non-CDL short haul, or other type of exception, talk to your supervisor. In general, the daily logbook page requires two groups of information. The first includes the date, the truck or tractor trailer number, the name and address of the carrier, shipping document numbers, and other details. The second records the time the driver spends in different types of duty status, such as on-duty, off-duty, on-duty not driving, or off-duty in the sleeper berth. It's this second group of information that can sometimes be confusing. In general, you're considered to be on duty anytime you are working or are required to be ready to work for any employer. Off-duty means you are relieved of all duty and responsibility for performing work. In most cases, each page of your log should account for all 24 hours of your day, including any time you spend working for other carriers or at other jobs. The hours are recorded on the log's daily graph grid with additional information, such as the locations where your changes of duty status occur, entered under Remarks. FMCSA regulations require you to make all of these entries yourself, and the information that you enter must be true and correct. The log should be updated constantly throughout each day, so that it always reflects your current duty status. You don't want to wait until the end of the day and try to rely on your memory to fill everything in. Once a page is completed, you should submit the original to your motor carrier for filing. Drivers who work for multiple motor carriers during the same 24-hour period need to submit copies of the day's log to each of those employers as well. You are also required to keep a copy for yourself for the current day as well as the previous 7 days of activity. Under FMCSA regulations, you must make all of your driver's logs materials available to agency inspectors or law enforcement upon request. This requirement also applies to information that has been logged electronically in equipment like automatic onboard recording devices, AOBRDs, or electronic logging devices, ELDs. These devices can display stored information about the truck, the trip, and your hours of service, transmit information to your motor carrier in real time, as well as print out or transmit the data to people like DOT enforcement officials when it's needed. If your truck has an onboard recording or electronic logging device, you must also have a manual on how to operate the device, instructions on how to view and transmit the electronic logs, and at least 8 blank paper logs that can be used as backups if your device malfunctions or fails. To help prevent accidents, injuries, and fatalities caused by driver fatigue, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, FMCSA, has established hours of service regulations that limit the maximum amount of time commercial drivers can spend on duty as well as behind the wheel. The 14-hour duty window and the 11-hour driving limit are the most basic of these rules. To start the clock on these maximums, FMCSA regulations require you to spend at least 10 consecutive hours off duty first. This helps ensure that you're fully rested before you begin driving. The 14-hour window is the maximum amount of time that you can be on duty in a 24-hour period. On-duty time includes all of the time that you spend working for a motor carrier, such as when you are driving a vehicle, waiting at a terminal, company facility, or other location to be dispatched, inspecting, fueling, washing, or servicing a truck, performing or supervising the loading or unloading of freight, and taking care of paperwork. This limit also includes any work that you perform for other employers in the same 24-hour period. Even if your other job doesn't involve driving a truck, the time you spend working there also counts as part of your on-duty time. When it comes to driving time, another limit comes into play. For every 14 hours on duty, FMCSA allows you to spend a maximum of 11 hours behind the wheel. You can divide up your 11 hours of driving time as needed in the 14-hour duty window, but usually you will have to include at least one 30-minute rest break for every 8 hours you spend in the driver's seat. Getting this break helps you stay sharp and drive safely up to your full 11-hour daily maximum. You're allowed to use either off-duty or on-duty not driving time for the break. You could spend it unloading and inspecting your truck, eating a meal, riding in the passenger seat, or resting in the sleeper berth while a partner drives. But however you choose to spend the break, that time does not extend your 14-hour duty window. Once you have spent 14 hours on duty in one 24-hour period, hours of service rules say you cannot drive again until you spend 10 consecutive hours off duty. You are considered to be off duty when you are relieved of all duty and responsibilities for performing work. This 10-hour dose of downtime restarts the clock on both of your daily limits. To keep track of how you spend your time, it's essential to keep your driver's daily logbook up to date. Here's how you would log a typical workday. Say you arrive at the terminal at 6 a.m. This is where your 14-hour on-duty window starts. You wait an hour to be dispatched, then hit the road on a round-trip delivery at 7 a.m. This is when your driving time starts. At noon, when you arrive at your destination, you have been on duty for 6 hours of the 14 hours that are permitted, driving for 5 hours of the allowable 11 hours. Now you take a half-hour lunch break while you are still on duty. This counts as the rest break you need to take for each 8 hours you spend behind the wheel. You could also spend it sitting in the terminal's ready room, updating your paperwork and driver's log. But either way, by 12:30, you have 6 more hours of driving time available. However, this break time does not extend the 14-hour duty window. So when it's over at 12:30, you have 7.5 hours of on-duty time left. And that's good, because the loading dock is busy and it's 2 p.m. before you could head out to drive back to your home terminal. The return trip also takes 5 hours of driving time, and when you get back at 7 p.m., you spend another half hour updating your logbook and completing other paperwork. So when you call it a day at 7:30 p.m., you have been on duty for 13.5 hours, and you have been able to spend 10 hours driving because you took your required half-hour rest break during lunch. If necessary, you could have extended your on-duty time by a half an hour by taking your 30-minute break during off-duty instead of on-duty time. The Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration enforces its 14-hour on-duty and 11-hour driving hours of service limits to help prevent the accidents, injuries, and fatalities that can result when commercial truckers suffer from driver fatigue. But even with these daily limits in place, drivers can still become fatigued after being on duty and driving multiple shifts over a number of days. So in addition to the daily limits, hours of service regulations require you to comply with one of two weekly limits as well. These are known as the 70-hour 8-day limit for drivers whose motor carrier operates every day of the week, and the 60-hour 7-day limit for drivers whose motor carrier does not operate every day. These rules specify how much time you should spend on duty and off duty during these 7 or 8-day stretches. You are on duty anytime you are working or are required to be ready to work either for your motor carrier or any other employer if you have multiple jobs. And you're off duty whenever you are relieved of all duty and responsibility for performing work. To understand the 60 and 70-hour weekly limits, it's important to remember that they are not tied to any specific days of the week, such as Sunday through Saturday or Wednesday through Wednesday. Instead, these 7 or 8-day periods float from one day to the next. As each new workday starts, the oldest 24-hour period drops out of the on-duty time calculations. Under the 60-hour 7-day limit, you are not allowed to continue driving a truck after being on duty for a total of 60 hours over any 7 consecutive days. Once you reach the 60-hour limit, you may perform other duty tasks, such as loading, unloading, or doing paperwork. But you will not be able to drive again until you drop below 60 total driving hours for a 7-day period. The 70-hour 8-day schedule works the same way. You are not allowed to drive a commercial motor vehicle after being on duty for a total of 70 hours over 8 consecutive days. Again, you can perform other types of duty, but you can't drive again until you get some downtime. To illustrate how you handle these duty limits, let's look at a real-world example. Say you're working a 60-hour 7-day schedule, and your 7 days begin at 5 a.m. on a Wednesday for a long-haul trip, and your daily on-duty schedule looks like this. Wednesday, 12.5 hours. Thursday, 8.5 hours. Friday, 10 hours. Saturday, 8 hours. Sunday, off, 0 hours. Monday, 10 hours. Tuesday, 9.5 hours. When you arrive at your final destination at 9 p.m. on the following Tuesday, you've accumulated 58.5 total hours of on-duty time over the past 7 days. So you only have 1.5 hours of on-duty time left to help unload or do paperwork. You know you're pushing the 60-hour limit, so you go off-duty for 6 hours while resting in the cab of your parked vehicle. When you return to duty at 8 a.m. the next morning after eating a meal and getting some shut-eye, your new workday is starting as well. That means the 12.5 hours you spent on duty the previous Wednesday drop out of your time calculations. Your total on-duty time falls from 58.5 to 46 hours. So you now have 14 on-duty hours available for the coming workday, of which you can drive a full 11 hours. This is one way to keep your running total of on-duty time under the 60-hour maximum. The FMCSA hours of service regulations also provide you with a way to reset your weekly clock to make a full 60 or 70 hours of on-duty time available to you again. You do this by taking at least 34 consecutive hours off duty, called the 34-hour restart. If the truck you're driving is equipped with a sleeper berth, it's not just a convenience, it's a practical advantage when managing your hours of service. A sleeper berth allows you to get quality downtime just about wherever and whenever you need it. And the hours of service regulations established by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, FMCSA, include a sleeper berth provision to help truckers make the most of their on-duty and off-duty time. The provision can be especially helpful in keeping a truck rolling when you are driving as part of a team taking turns at the wheel. In these situations, you are considered to be on duty when you are working or are required to be ready to work. and you are off duty whenever you are relieved of all duty and responsibility for performing work. There are two ways you can use the sleeper berth provision. First, you can use time in the sleeper berth to get some or all of the 10 consecutive hours of off-duty time that you need to restart both your 14-hour on-duty and 11-hour driving limits. You can also combine your time in the sleeper berth with other off-duty time, such as time that you spend in the passenger seat of the truck immediately before or after your berth time, to accumulate the 10 consecutive hours required to restart the clock on your on-duty and driving times. The sleeper berth provision also gives you a second, more flexible option to accumulating that off-duty time as well. It allows you to combine one period of at least 7 or 8 consecutive hours in the sleeper berth with another period at least 2 or 3 consecutive hours off-duty in or out of the berth to meet the 10-hour requirement. The 2 periods do not count against your 14-hour on-duty time. It does not matter which period you choose to take first, but at the end of the second period, you have a new point on the clock from which to calculate your available hours. This calculation point will always be from the end of the first rest period. Here's how it works. Let's say you come on duty at 7 a.m. and drive from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. You have now used 8 hours of on-duty time and 5 hours of driving time. You then spend 7 hours in the sleeper berth while your partner drives and get up again at 10 p.m. Under the sleeper berth provision, your rest period in the sleeper berth does not count against your 14-hour on-duty limit. So at 10 p.m., you still have 6 hours of your original on-duty time remaining. Now you get behind the wheel and drive from 10 p.m. through to 4 a.m. the next morning when you reach your destination, using up 6 hours of on-duty and driving time. At this point, you have used up all 14 hours of on-duty time and the 11 hours of driving time that you started with yesterday. So while the truck is being unloaded, you go off-duty for 3 hours. When you return to duty at 7 a.m., you have accumulated 10 hours of off-duty time, because the sleeper berth provision allows you to combine this morning's 3-hour rest period with the 7-hour break you took the previous day. To figure your on-duty and driving hours limits, you can now use a new calculation point that falls at the end of your first rest period, which was 10 p.m. the night before. By using the sleeper berth provision, you have gained 8 hours of on-duty time, out of which you can spend another 5 hours behind the wheel. As we've seen, truckers can avoid the hazards of driver fatigue and maximize their paid time on duty by following hours of service regulations established by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, FMCSA. Let's review. Hours of service regulations help to prevent driver fatigue by limiting how long truckers can spend on duty and driving and requiring them to get appropriate downtime between these periods. These rules take the form of daily and weekly maximums for on-duty and driving time. FMCSA also requires drivers to track and document their hours of service in a hard copy or electronic record of duty status, also known as a driver's daily log. This information must be made available to law enforcement and FMCSA inspectors upon request. Now that you understand hours of service regulations and how to follow them, you can ensure that you, your coworkers, and everyone who shares the road with you reaches their destination safely every day.